When World War I broke out in 1914, it would have been easy to assume that the Central Powers wouldn't stand a chance. To their west were the combined forces of Britain and France, two of the most advanced nations in the world. To their east was Russia, which on paper might have seemed the most formidable enemy of them all. It was by far the biggest country, meaning that it would be extremely difficult to invade. The border between Germany and Russia was very close to the German capital, meaning that if Russia could advance just a small way into Germany, it might be able to take the city and force Germany to surrender. Russia also had the biggest population, giving it by far the largest army. When the war started, it had about 1.4 million soldiers, more than Germany and Austria combined. However, as it turned out, Russia wouldn't dominate the war. In fact, it would dramatically underperform expectations. Of the major powers that started the war, it was the only one that didn't make it to the end in 1918. There were many battles where it significantly outnumbered the enemy and still lost. So what accounts for that terrible performance? In short, why was Russia so useless in World War I? There are, of course, a huge number of factors to mention, but before we get into that, let's have a quick overview of what happened, the story of Russia in World War I. In June of 1914, Europe was at peace and war didn't seem to be on the horizon. In fact, the continent was at the pinnacle of its power. The past century had been relatively peaceful, allowing for levels of prosperity and technological progress never before seen in human history. There were tensions between the nations, but they had just about been kept in check. Then, on the 28th of June, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. That act of terrorism would end up triggering an astonishing escalation into what would become the biggest war the world had ever seen. The German and Austro-Hungarian empires would find themselves fighting the combined forces of Britain, France and Russia. Germany's plan was to first invade France, knocking it out of the war quickly before turning its attention to Russia. It hoped that Russia would take a long time to get its forces in order, giving it time to defeat France. In fact, Russia was ready for war much sooner than expected. Russia's plan was to move quickly into Germany, take the capital, Berlin, and force it to surrender. However, before it could advance on Berlin, it needed to take territory in the north and south in order to avoid getting outflanked. In August, Russian forces moved into East Prussia, but the offensive was a complete disaster. The Germans annihilated two Russian armies, pushing them back across the border. The Russians had made no progress and lost about 250,000 men. The Germans lost only 40,000. The Russians also lost a lot of ground in the center. In fact, it was only in the south where Russia did have some success, pushing the Austro-Hungarian army back. The next year went even worse for Russia. It started as a stalemate, with neither side achieving any significant advantage. Although the Russians did have some victories, they couldn't capitalize on them, as the German army could move its forces faster due to its much better railway network. All the while, Russia was taking enormous numbers of casualties, far more than Germany. In the first few months of 1915, it lost about 400,000 men, while Germany lost only a quarter of that. Eventually, the stalemate was broken in May when Germany and Austria launched a huge offensive that broke the Russian lines. Throughout the summer of 1915, Russia lost an astonishing amount of territory, essentially abandoning much of Eastern Europe. In total, it lost about 4 million men in 1915. 1916 would turn out to be Russia's most successful year of the war. In June, it launched a huge offensive in the south against the Austro-Hungarians and did manage to make some gains. It was known as the Brusilov offensive, and it was the biggest campaign of the war, with up to 4 million men involved. The goal was to force Austria-Hungary to collapse, leaving Germany fighting alone. However, while the offensive did cause a huge crisis for Austria-Hungary, it didn't knock it out of the war. By 1917, Russia had taken enormous losses in terms of men and territory. However, it was still fighting, and theoretically its population was more than big enough to replenish its forces. What would eventually be the death blow to the Russian war effort was the political situation inside Russia. The population was sick of the strains of war and angry at the government, which they saw as incompetent and out of touch. The royal family in particular were deeply unpopular. The Tsar was seen as responsible for the losses in the war, since he was supreme commander of the army. His wife was German-born, and many people thought that she might actually be helping the Germans win. As one of her most influential advisors, she had chosen the Siberian mystic and faith healer Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a strange and murky figure, and there were rumours that he was a serial rapist. Many people in the public thought that he had put a spell on the Tsarina and that he was controlling her with witchcraft. All that discontent boiled over on the 3rd of March 1917 when factory workers in the capital went on strike to protest against the government. Over the next few days, the protests escalated until thousands were on the streets. On the 8th, women, angry about bread shortages, joined the protests, many of them carrying placards that read, "Down with the Tsar." The troops in the city were ordered to quell the unrest, but they refused and joined the protesters. The government had lost control of the capital. It was clear that the only way to restore order in the capital was for the Tsar to abdicate, which he did on the 15th of March. Russia was now to be run by a caretaker government that would have control only until a new constitution could be drawn up. Regarding the war, in theory, Russia was to continue fighting, but in practice, the political instability would make it much harder to fight effectively. Support for the war was diminishing over time, and many people wanted to simply pull out. Russia did launch one last big offensive in July of 1917, which would turn out to be a complete disaster. Eventually, after months of political chaos, it was the communist Bolsheviks that took power in November of 1917. They formally pulled Russia out of World War I on the 3rd of March 1918. Russia's participation in World War I was over, having been a total failure. Overall, it had been one of the least effective participants in the war. So what accounts for that terrible performance by the Russian military? Why was it so ineffective? Well, the first thing to mention is that it was extremely badly equipped and supplied. Many Russian troops literally didn't have rifles. That was mainly because there simply weren't enough. When the war started, Russia had more soldiers than rifles. It had about 5 million soldiers, but only 4.5 million rifles to give them. That initial shortage was made even worse by huge numbers of rifles getting lost or broken on the battlefield. The situation got so bad that in one battle in late 1914, half of the Russian reinforcements didn't have rifles. A whole load of desperate measures were taken to try to solve the problem. All civilians were told to hand in any rifles that they had. There was even money offered to soldiers that would go out and retrieve rifles from the battlefield. Wounded soldiers were told to try to hold on to their rifles as they withdrew, even when they might be about to die. The lack of equipment was never fully sorted out. Even at the end of the war, Russia had only about 2/3 of the weapons that it needed to supply its soldiers. Another pressing issue was the lack of ammunition. For example, at one point when they were defending Poland in 1915, they had only 10 shells per day to be used in their howitzers. Even when the Russians did have success and break enemy lines, they couldn't press their advantage because they didn't have enough ammo. According to one Russian general, thanks to the strength of their fire, the Germans could achieve quick results. Unfortunately, we couldn't match them because of insufficient ammo for our rifles and light artillery. Our offensive actions and counterattacks, deprived of the necessary artillery fire, either developed slowly or didn't take place at all. Our soldiers met a wall of fire from the enemy or obstacles and fortifications not destroyed by our own artillery fire. That lack of equipment was in large part due to Russia's military-industrial complex not being as developed as other great powers. In other countries, such as Britain and Germany, most military production was done by private companies. Capitalism was by then fairly established in those countries, and so there was a fairly mature private sector that could produce far more than the state. In Russia, capitalism had barely got going before 1914, and that was reflected in its war production. The Russian government had a deep hostility towards private enterprise, which meant that war preparation relied mainly on state-owned factories rather than private industry. In fact, the Russian government was more willing to place contracts abroad with foreign manufacturers than with Russian producers. As you can imagine, that meant that when war broke out and demand for military products skyrocketed, it was very difficult for Russia to get what it needed. Many things simply weren't produced in Russia, such as precursor chemicals for explosives. Russia had been buying those from Germany, so as you can imagine, that left them totally out to dry when they eventually ended up at war with Germany. The lack of proper equipment fed into another major cause of Russia's ineffectiveness in the war: low morale. There were many reasons for Russia's problems with morale, but often it was related to Russia's class-ridden society. One issue was that the majority of the foot soldiers were peasants, while the officers were of the landowning class that people thought had oppressed the peasants. Overall, that meant that there was a bad relationship between officers and soldiers, leading the army to be less united. The men didn't feel that they were one people fighting for one cause. Something that added to that was how much contempt the soldiers were treated with. That was clear from the way that the soldiers weren't adequately equipped or trained, but also from the attitude of the officers. In the words of historian Roger Rees, there was an ineradicable habit to count rifles and cartridges, but not soldiers. The soldier is only able to obey, and he can live in dirty pits covered with branches of trees. That contempt with which the soldiers were treated demoralized them, making them far less committed to the cause. Another reason for the low motivation of the Russian soldiers is that many of them simply didn't feel that they were Russian. By the time World War I broke out, other nations of Europe, such as Britain and France, had very strong national identities. The population of France felt that they belonged to France and were therefore much more willing to fight and die for it. In Russia, by contrast, the feeling of belonging to one single nation was much weaker. Russia was much more of an empire with a huge number of ethnic minorities, many of whom didn't actually want to be a part of it. Areas such as the Caucasus, Poland or Ukraine had large majorities of non-Russian people, many of whom actually hated Russia and wanted independence. A good example of that lack of loyalty came in 1916 when the Tsar implemented conscription in Central Asia. The people there were particularly unhappy about being part of the Russian Empire and certainly didn't want to fight for it. The majority of them were Muslims and they were sympathetic to the Islamic Ottoman Empire, which Russia was actually fighting. In fact, the Ottoman Empire called for holy war or jihad against the Christian Russian Empire. The attempt at conscription backfired spectacularly and caused a huge revolt of about 100,000 people. Russia was forced to divert desperately needed troops away from the war in Europe to put down the revolt. Overall, the Russian army was made up of men far less committed to the cause than that of other nations, which badly affected morale. That lack of morale led to large numbers of desertions. Desertion had long been a problem for the Russian military. For instance, in 1912, before the war had even started, there were about 13,000 desertions, or 1% of the army. As you can imagine, that dramatically increased when war started. In the winter of 1914, the Russian army was losing tens of thousands of men per month. The problem was incredibly hard to combat given Russia's enormous landmass. The penalty for desertion was 5 years in prison, but of course many deserters left the front because they feared for their lives, so the threat of 5 years in prison wasn't much of a deterrent. The problem got particularly bad during the Great Retreat of 1915, when Russia essentially abandoned Eastern Europe. The withdrawal was extremely chaotic, which made it easy for soldiers to get separated from their units and just leave the front. There was also a huge number of refugees streaming eastwards, so men could easily claim to be a civilian refugee. It is of course impossible to get accurate numbers for the total number of deserters, but the Russian authorities managed to arrest at least 400,000 during the war. If that is the number of deserters that were found and arrested, I think we are safe to assume that the actual number would have been far, far higher. By comparison, Britain and Germany registered about 30,000 deserters each during the war, so the Russian number is incomparably higher. So, being ill-equipped and having low morale were major problems for the Russian military, but there were many others. Another huge factor was the enormous amount of incompetence in all levels of the military. At the lowest level, the foot soldiers were incompetent purely from their lack of education and training. Here we see a particularly stark difference between Russian versus German soldiers. Almost all of the German soldiers were literate and had a decent level of basic training. For Russia, on the other hand, almost 9 in 10 of the soldiers were peasants, and the majority of them were illiterate. That is another manifestation of the fact that Russia was far less developed than other nations at the start of the war. It was a big problem because war was getting ever more technical as technology advanced. Calculating artillery trajectories or using radios for communication wasn't easy for peasants that had spent their entire lives working in the fields. Training was also poor and hadn't caught up with all the technological advancements. However, it wasn't just the soldiers that didn't know what they were doing. The incompetence could be seen right up the chain of command. One example was at the very beginning of the war when the Russians were trying to take East Prussia. The Russian forces were divided into two armies, one under the command of Samsonov and the other under Rennenkampf. Combined, those two armies had 500,000 men and should easily have been able to defeat the German army, which was about half their size. However, because of a lack of coordination and cooperation between the two generals, the Russian armies were about to get absolutely blown off the battlefield. Essentially, because the two men didn't communicate well, the much smaller German army was able to tackle each Russian army individually and defeat each one. Rennenkampf moved first, attacking East Prussia from the east and engaging the German forces. After the initial skirmishes, it was actually the Russian army that gained the upper hand and the Germans were forced to withdraw. However, Rennenkampf foolishly didn't pursue the Germans, even though he could have inflicted heavy losses. The Germans were chaotically retreating and would have been very vulnerable. Instead, believing that he had won a decisive victory, he decided to let his men rest. After 3 days, he resumed the advance, but found that the Germans were nowhere to be found. While Rennenkampf was blowing a great opportunity to get the upper hand, Samsonov was advancing from the south into East Prussia. He was aware of Rennenkampf's earlier victory, but in many ways the information that he had been given was actually misleading. He had been told that Rennenkampf had won a big victory over the Germans, and therefore he wouldn't meet much resistance. Supreme Command sent him a message saying, "The enemy has only insignificant forces in front of you," and urged him to rapidly advance north. In fact, Samsonov was walking into a trap. The Germans actually had the majority of their forces intact and were waiting for Samsonov's incautious advance. They actually knew exactly where the Russians were due to another terrible error by the Russian commanders. They were transmitting unencrypted radio messages. Those radio signals were getting intercepted by the Germans, who knew exactly what the two Russian armies were doing. The Russians should have been encrypting the radio signals, but they were so disorganized that the commanders didn't have the encryption keys that they needed. The Germans knew that Rennenkampf was advancing very slowly, so they concentrated all their forces on Samsonov's army in the south. The two sides met at Tannenberg, and immediately the Russian army began to take heavy losses. Rennenkampf should have been able to come to Samsonov's aid, but Samsonov had actually decided to break his telegraph connection with the Russian Supreme Command. He had been explicitly told to stay in contact at all costs, but he decided to disobey orders and break his telegraph connection. That was likely because he thought he needed to be closer to the front line and couldn't if he was maintaining communication with Supreme Command. That meant that while his army was getting pummeled, Rennenkampf wasn't able to come to his aid because he didn't know where his army was. The battle would turn out to be a complete disaster for Russia. It lost about 100,000 men, the majority of them captured. Samsonov was so ashamed of his failure that he took his own life. After that success, the German army was able to swing round and meet Rennenkampf in the east. Again, the Russian army was no match for the Germans and was forced to withdraw back across the border. The battle for East Prussia was lost, in large part because the two Russian generals had been so poor at communicating and coordinating. That may have been in part because the two generals actually despised each other. In Russia's war with Japan 9 years earlier, Samsonov had publicly humiliated Rennenkampf after a defeat. That level of incompetence from the Russian generals was typical throughout the war. In fact, the Russian War Minister Vladimir Sokomlinov wrote, "Our troops are fighting heroically, but some of our generals, better if they'd been fighting for the other side." That is ironic coming from Sokomlinov because he himself was absolutely useless. Sokomlinov had been War Minister for 5 years and had totally failed to prepare Russia for war. He failed to keep Russia up to date with changes in warfare, stating, "I have not read a military manual in the last 25 years. He was described by one British officer as a light-hearted man, characterized by his enemies as a buffoon, whose influence over the emperor was ascribed to his fund of excellent stories. Essentially, Sokomlinov had his position because the Tsar liked him, even though his incompetence was well known. It is the perfect example of personal ties taking precedence over ability. Sokomlinov did a terrible job in preparing the Russian army for war. All the shortages that I mentioned before were in large part down to him. He hampered the Russian war effort so badly that he was eventually tried for treason. Something particularly unforgivable was that the Russian War Ministry didn't tell their allies about their lack of equipment. Britain and France might have been able to help, but Sokomlinov told them that everything was fine and Russia had everything that it needed. Part of the problem was that the Russian War Ministry was totally out of touch with reality. According to one general, some of them were entertaining the idea of arming entire units with long-handed axes. That proposal, to essentially send medieval warriors to the front line, never actually materialized, but it does show the extent to which they were a bit off their rocker. Of course, one of the most incompetent figures throughout the whole of the Russian war effort was dear Nicholas II himself. In fact, Nicholas was so useless so much of the time, I'm actually going to do an entire video about how he contributed to the loss of the war and the downfall of his regime. One of the biggest decisions that Nicholas made was to make himself supreme commander of the entire Russian forces. That was a terrible decision for many reasons. First, he didn't have any military experience to qualify him for the role. Second, it meant that there was no way that he could escape blame for how badly the war was going. Third, with Nicholas no longer in the capital, it meant that his wife was left in charge. The Tsar's wife, Alexandra Feodorovna, was extremely unpopular. She also made some terrible decisions. One of the worst was firing the most competent war minister that Russia had. Once the previous incompetent war minister, Sokomlinov, was fired, a new man was appointed for the role, Alexei Polivanov. Polivanov was far more competent and professional than his predecessor. He could communicate well, both with military and political figures, meaning that for the first and only time there was some degree of coordination. He also did a great job of sorting out the problems in logistics and training. Unfortunately, Polivanov was going to be fired for petty, personal reasons. It was in part because he had been critical of Rasputin, the mystic and faith healer that had a huge amount of influence over the Tsar's wife. Also, he had, quite correctly, urged the Tsar not to take supreme command of the military, seeing that it would be a disaster. That led him to fall out of favour with the Tsar's wife, and so she dismissed him in March of 1916. Russia had lost the best war minister that it would have throughout the entire war. For all that the Russian military was ineffective and incompetent from day one, the thing that finally lost the war was actually domestic politics. It was the revolution of 1917. Ultimately, it lost the war not because a German army made it all the way to the capital, but because it collapsed from within. The first major step in that process was the abdication of the Tsar in March. There had been enormous protests in the capital for about 2 weeks, and eventually the government lost control. It was actually the Tsar's closest advisors that told him to abdicate, believing that it was the only way for them to restore order in the capital. The abdication of Tsar Nicholas did quell the protests, but it left a power vacuum. The old system of government was gone, but it wasn't clear what should replace it. For the next few months, there would be political chaos in Russia. One of the biggest problems was that there was essentially two rival parliaments. The first was the Duma, which had been around for about 10 years. During that time, it had had some power, and now that the Tsar was gone, it was, in theory, the sovereign parliament in Russia. The other parliament was the Petrograd Soviet, essentially the city council of the capital. It had been formed 2 years earlier to represent workers in Petrograd. The Petrograd Soviet was far more left-wing and more radical than the Duma. With the Tsar gone and everything up in the air, Russia would essentially spend the next few months gripped by a power struggle between those two parliaments. The first way that the political turmoil would affect the war effort was when the Petrograd Soviet issued its first decree, Order No. 1. The order instructed soldiers to obey orders from their officers and the Duma only when they didn't contradict with anything that the Petrograd Soviet had said. Essentially, it was a power grab. The Petrograd Soviet was telling the soldiers that they should listen to it rather than the Duma. Order No. 1 also did some things to undermine the authority of officers. It said that soldiers didn't have to address officers with the traditional "Your Honor," and officers were obliged to speak politely to their men. Also, soldiers would no longer have to accept military discipline when they were off duty. As you can imagine, all that had a very bad effect on discipline. The men began to question officers or even arrest them. In a few cases, soldiers actually murdered their officers. Order No. 1 also created soldiers' committees which were to represent the interests of the soldiers. That was another challenge to the authority of the officers. Overall, Order No. 1 destabilized the army, weakening the hierarchy and creating even more disorder and chaos. The relationship between officers and their men became even more strained than it was already. Within Russia itself, people were beginning to question whether they should even keep fighting at all. Many people wanted to just focus on defending Russia, but never actually attack the Germans. That anti-war sentiment actually led to a political crisis in April. The foreign minister sent a telegram saying that Russia would continue fighting until it totally defeated Germany. That was hugely unpopular and led to mass demonstrations, forcing the foreign minister and the war minister to resign. Despite that, in the summer of 1917, Russia would launch one last offensive of the war, the so-called June Offensive. By now, discipline in the army had totally collapsed. Once men arrived at the front line, they would immediately flee. In the words of one junior officer, people just fled once they got off the trains. They fled to their homes, deserted, fled anywhere they wanted. There just wasn't any discipline anymore. Even the men that stayed on the front line were completely out of control. There was mass rape, destruction of property, and anti-Jewish massacres known as pogroms. There was also mass fraternization with German troops. Nevertheless, the offensive did go ahead, and initially it went well. The Russians were able to gain some ground. Then the Central Powers counterattacked and broke the Russian line. The Russian soldiers retreated as fast as they could, and the army began to completely disintegrate. Rates of desertion got higher than ever before. Perhaps about 2 million men deserted over the course of 1917. Eventually, in October, the War Ministry told the government that the army could no longer fight. Russia had no choice but to request peace terms. That collapse of 1917 topped off what was an overall terrible war for Russia. From the very beginning, it had been plagued by incompetence at all levels of the military. Ultimately, the collapse of its military was a reflection of the collapse of its political system. Russia would then enter into a period of chaos and civil war until it eventually emerged as the world's first communist power.